and have a conversation with the technical guy that you're going to use. So just before we go into the actual stuff, a little bit about myself. So the current roles I play are, I'm founder of Red Labs, which is a partner with Techcelerate. I'm also one of the founders and CTO for a company called VoiceIQ. That's an AI, VoIP, and CRM company product. I'm also the acting CTO for a company called Study Atlas. That's an edtech platform, and one of the technology advisors for a company called Mango B2B, which is a marketplace platform. And my background is from real-time gambling platforms, fintech platforms, SaaS platforms, AI platforms, and mainly cloud services. So that's a little bit about my background. So hopefully I have used the experience I have to come up with these text, these slides, and will be useful for you guys. So the biggest question a lot of people have is, what is your technology stack? And usually a technology stack is divided into two main areas. You get the client-side stack and you get the server-side stack. But obviously nowadays you have to have a base stack or some of the operational stacks that you're going to use for hosting your platform, for building the code base that you have done, and logging all of the stuff that's happening within the platform. But from a client-side perspective, there are two ends to it. You get the mobile end and the front-end side of it. So mobile, from a mobile perspective, you get the usual hybrid, languages or frameworks like React Native, Vue Native, Ionic, things like that. And then you get the native ones, which is the Swift, usage of Swift for iOS applications, and usage of Kotlin for Android-based applications. And then we move on to the front-end side of the client-side section, where you have frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js, and so forth, right? But this is primarily talking about client-server-side architecture. And you also get things like WordPress. I'm not a big fan of WordPress, but it doesn't mean that you can't use WordPress for an MVP. From my perspective, I've used WordPress for things like landing pages and maybe a quick e-commerce site, things like that. But my personal preference is, I don't think it's good enough to scale that platform when you need it to. Moving back onto this, so you get the server-side stuff, and the server side is usually divided into two main segments. You get the backend logic-based approach, where you can write it in Java, JavaScript, C#, PHP. And then you have the databases, which usually a lot of people go with SQL, and that comes to Microsoft SQL or MySQL. You get Postgres as well. And then you get the non-SQL stuff like MongoDB, Cassandra, Redis, and so forth. But the usage of Cassandra, Redis, and Neo4j, which is a graph database, are very low unless you have a very specific use case for it. So that's kind of what a technology stack comprises of. And then I explained, you have to still make a decision on which cloud services you're going to use. And that could depend on the expertise you have in-house. It could depend on the credits you have got through Techcelerate maybe. And the build services you're going to use to actually deploy the code base into the cloud services. And one of the most important things that a lot of people miss is the logging service. So if you're going to MVP, or if you're releasing sites to public usage, you definitely have to have some kind of logging service so that you can track what's happening with your platform, where the errors are coming, and so forth. So all of this kind of builds up what a technology stack is. So this is just basically the explanation I gave before, and it's just text. So in case anybody wants this slide, I can provide it to you afterwards.
Just a quick question. Could you give examples of logging services you've used?
Yes, so we use things like, there's one stack called ELK, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash. So that's a very good logging service. But also you get things like open source logging services like Stacktrace and things like that. So there are many other logging services you could use internally, because we're using, for VoiceIQ, we use Microsoft Azure. And because of that, we use something called Application Insights as a logging service, where we push all the logs and start searching. But the most, I think the most traditional no, not the traditional. I think the most used one probably is the ELK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So these are some of the technology stacks that are being used primarily by a lot of companies. So you get the LAMP stack, which is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And Linux is just a hosting platform. Apache is the web server. MySQL is the database, and PHP is the language that you write your front end and back end in. Then that was a traditional stack, but now you have this mean and mearn stack. So in the mean and mearn stack, every 3 segments of it are the same except for the front end part of it. So you get MongoDB as as the database, Express.js as the web server, Node as the backend services. So you write your APIs in Node, and then if your tech team is good at Angular, then you use Angular. If your tech team is good at React, then you use React. But all of this is a JavaScript-based tech stack. So everything is primary end-to-end JavaScript. That's why it's quite popular as well. Then obviously, if you're coming from a Python world, you have the Python Django framework. So the language that you use is Python. The database is MySQL. Apache is the web service and web server, and Django is the framework that it's like an MVC framework that helps you to build things around using Python and host it on Apache. So those are some of the very popular stacks that are out there. However, my go-to stack is different because I'm not really too strong in JavaScript, but so hence the reason I go for C# for a .NET using a .NET backend. And earlier, the downfall of using .NET was you can only run it on a Windows platform or a Microsoft platform. But now with the introduction of .NET Core, you can run it on a Linux platform as well. And then from a front-end perspective, I use React and Redux, which is JavaScript based. And I also use, because most of my apps that I create are usually mobile and front-end, so I use React Native and Redux. And there's an advantage. I go with React and Redux. It's because when you have a front end and a mobile app, you can unify some of the layers between the 2 stacks, between the 2 client-side technologies, and reduce the time to get it out into the market. Only the presentation layer changes. That means from the front-end perspective, your presentation for the users using the website changes. And from the mobile perspective, the presentation layer that's using Android or iOS changes. But the stack right underneath that to configure, to share the logic, to share the API calls could be kind of unified and made your development process much faster. From a database perspective, I use SQL database because it's for most. So this stack is usually a hackathon stack that I use. And for hackathons, you don't need like NoSQL databases usually. So I just go with an MySQL database or an MS SQL database. And my favorite my cloud services, my go-to cloud service is Azure, because I'm certified in the Azure space. And I do know AWS, but I prefer Azure because I use it on a day-to-day basis. So those are the kind of tech stacks that are out there. Any questions so far? Oh, happy to move forward. Cool.
So probably worth getting, what tech stacks have you guys gone with? In the past, everything I've done, we built on LAMP, and obviously had some Angular, but I've not ventured into anything else.
Yeah, for us, we're kind of LAMP at the moment, although we use Nginx as opposed to Apache. And then we're AWS. We actually use a third-party service called Laravel Vapor to deploy. So it actually wraps up our PHP and pushes it out to a Lambda function. And that's really cheap for us and resilient. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Front end, we use Vue.js as our sort of front end framework. And then, so we use Laravel as our PHP framework.
Yeah, myself, we're starting to use Mern a lot, but we used to do a lot of Ruby on Rails. So we used to do like Ruby on Rails MVC frameworks. And then obviously, I think because predominantly a lot of people using PHP, we usually have Laravel or a kind of Web 2.0 kind of MVC framework using PHP and the LAMP stack.
We use Python Django with a mix of MySQL and MongoDB and Nginx instead of Apache.
Yeah, Python Django is becoming quite a mainstream framework, and even the one Jamie mentioned, Laravel and Vue.js. I think for some reason people who use Laravel love Vue.js, and I'm not sure why, but they are becoming quite a mainstream service as well.
I think so. Vue.js is kind of like a first-class citizen in the Laravel world.
I see.
So there's quite a lot of things like session authentication and stuff is handled really, really well between the two. So not quite out of the box, but it's almost an out of the box solution.
Yeah.
And there's loads and loads of community support for it. We actually use another thing called Tailwind CSS. I don't know if people have come across. It's a utility first framework for CSS. Makes life so much easier for it. But that has kind of first party support within Vue.js and within Laravel. So I think just a lot of the time it's more that when people are watching videos on it or asking questions on it, the community is very much focused around those three things. So that's what's driving its kind of adoption.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen like Laravel framework has things like Laravel Passport, Laravel Cashier, and which out of the box gives you authentication, gives you subscription-based integration with Stripe.
Yeah.
It's really good.
There's loads of bits out of it. It's all nice and encapsulated as well, so you don't have to take it. It's not built in. And then they've just released something now called Laravel Sanctum, which allows you to authenticate your front ends really easily. So if you've got like you've got React and Redux, and then for your mobile, it handles all of that for you, all of the OAuth kind of stuff really, really well. So it's nice and easy just to get up and running really quickly.
Yeah. Cool. Should I continue? Or?
Obviously, others don't know what they got.
Amila, is there a framework you recommend for prototyping versus scaling? Like, is there something you would say, hey, if you just want to quickly do something that's really quick and dirty, versus something that you would want to scale with, and obviously,
Yeah.
Is there difference?
Yeah, there's a section in the slides which I have kind of covered it. I could say, so we can have a discussion on that once we come there. Yeah.
Robert just joined. Do you basically? Amila's just been a couple of slides. I don't know whether you want to talk about what stack you're using. Just yeah, that's all we.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you okay with it?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Should I continue? Or?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So things that we usually have to consider when building an MVP, right? Basically, so this whole thing is talking about building an MVP stack, and then effectively once the MVP is validated, how do you scale that stack forward, right? But based on the project type, the stack kind of differs. So if you, the different project types you have are MVP projects, you have the mid-sized project, and you have the large projects. So these are some of the factors that the founders need to consider before founders or the technical people need to consider before coming up with a tech stack. The other thing is time to market. So again, time to market depends on different things. So the maturity of the chosen tech stack. So the Vue.js was kind of new, and for a certain time people didn't embrace Vue.js, but now, just like Jamie said, Vue.js is becoming more mainstream as well, because there's a lot of community support. It's much easier to handle. At first, Angular was quite good, but the way Google does its versioning is pretty crazy. They change versions every 1 or 2 years, and I think within a matter of 6 or 7 years, it's already at Angular 9, and they also missed 4 and 5. Nobody knows where 4 and 5 went. So, and that major change versions are kind of, it breaks a lot of things. As a result, a lot of people are trying to move away from Angular into React. One of the advantages of React is, just like I mentioned before, if you have developers who understands the React ecosystem, then that person can easily understand the React Native ecosystem as well. And as a result, a company who has expertise in developing React apps can develop React Native apps. So that's one of the advantages. And so I think it's pretty much similar to Vue as well, because I think there's a framework called Vue Native now, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're a Vue developer, then I guess it's becoming easier to develop the Vue Native side of it as well. So so some of the factors, again, time to market, it also depends on the expertise of your development team. So if you have a development team that is expertise on, example, let's say .NET and maybe React, then it might be better to stick to that kind of tech stack. But if you're good at .NET, does not mean you can move to Java. You could. But a person who is expertise in a .NET framework or world understands the web services that you need to use, understands the cloud services you need to use, understand those small tips and tricks in enhancing web service performance and so forth. But if you're moving into, let's say a company decides, okay, you guys are from a .NET background, but I want to build my backend in Java, then that transition is going to have an impact on time to market and things like that. Another thing to consider is the performance and scalability. So this does not necessarily mean the performance of your platform, but it means, so scale up is things, how much features you want to add, how many more elements you want to add into your MVP product, while scale out means how many devices or platforms you want to run this product on. So for example, your MVP could be focusing just on web and a backend service, while some people would want to release it on web and mobile devices and tablets and etc. And maybe IoT devices, whichever it is. So those are some of the things that you need to consider. Again, and one of the biggest factors is the cost. So this is just a graph that I picked up from one of the sites, which I have referenced in my last slide. So as you can see, I have been working in, so my previous company, we worked on, it was a pure .NET stack. However, we had F# for certain areas of, areas in the platform. And the problem with that was people who understood F# were quite hard to find, hence their salary is quite big. But people who knew C# was very, you can find it easily, and you didn't have to spend so much. So cost is a big factor for companies when they are trying to build out MVPs, and hence the reason MERN and Mean stack are quite famous, because the entire stack from end to end is JavaScript, and you can find JavaScript developers quite, they're more frequent, they're readily available, and they usually know the entire stack end to end. Because the Node.js is built in JavaScript, Express.js is basically run on JavaScript, MongoDB is the JavaScript database, and React or Angular are all JavaScript. So some of the factors to consider, most tools are open source at this point. Currently, like example, earlier when you wanted to run a .NET framework, you needed to kind of buy licenses for getting Visual Studio enterprise editions and things like that. But now that's all out of the door. You can use Visual Studio Code. So they have made most of the tools open source now. Again, cost of development depends on the chosen stack, because if your chosen stack kind of comes from this area, then your cost of development for paying developers are quite low. But if it comes from this area, then you can see it's going to be quite expensive, because things like Go, Scala, Clojure, F#, they're more of functional programming, and functional programmers are hard to find compared to object-oriented programmers. It's because I think it's a different mindset, hence the reason that's the case. Also, companies have to think about technology education and licensing. So I mentioned that before. Again, if you have a diverse team, then you would want your team to pick up and stick to a certain stack. And as a result, you would want to educate them, and you want to buy, things like training programs and stuff like that. And finally, maintenance and operational cost. So maintenance and operational cost depends on multiple things. So there was I worked with one company. When they started off 2 years ago, they started off with Angular 4. And 2 years after, now it's Angular 9. So they cannot easily convert it to Angular 9 because the change from Angular 4 to Angular 9 has major breaking changes. And that would mean maintenance and operational cost needs to be spent on doing those big changes. However, comparing, so unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with the Vue ecosystem, but from a React ecosystem, those breaking changes are quite minimal. They do have breaking changes, but it's not as drastic as Angular, and that's one of the downfalls. So we also have to keep in mind the operational and maintenance cost of things as part of things to consider. Finally, I think this is one of the last bits. So when you are creating a tech stack, there are multiple things to focus on, and this basically depends on the type of users you're going to provide your product to. You could have mobile first users, you could have mobile only users, you could have mobile later users, and those are the three stuff. But my recommendation is that you focus on just one thing to validate your value proposition if you're building an MVP. And so the mobile first is you usually use so WordPress sites are usually mobile first because you build a web and it's automatic. Usually the themes are automatically responsive, but you kind of have a simple UI and a simple flow into your application. So these could be things like landing pages. It could be very maybe an e-commerce site where the flow is pretty simple. So those are mobile first approaches. Mobile only approach is where you have services that only want to provide a mobile device. So example, it could be earlier things like WhatsApp was just mobile based. Obviously now they have a web based thing, but if you check the layout, it's almost very similar. And if you're going with the mobile first approach, usually the recommendation is that you build your application for the iOS ecosystem, and there's a good reason for that. So from a mobile perspective, you have iOS and Android. You do have the Windows, but I don't think anybody uses Windows Mobile anymore. So from these two platforms, if you think about it, Apple has done a really good job in constraining their device sizes and maintaining, kind of curating their ecosystem quite nicely. However, from an Android market, you have all kinds of device sizes and so many variations to it, and that would mean as a company who is developing a mobile only platform, if you are going down the route of just developing an Android application first, that means you'll have to test a lot for different mobile device sizes, how it's responsive, how the flow works, and etc. Hence the reason a lot of companies that when they're developing MVPs, they always launch the iOS mobile first, because the things that they have to consider are quite minimal compared to what Android has. And that is if you're going with the native platform. So if you're using React Native, it doesn't matter much, but I think the time spent on testing an Android device is much more compared to time spent on testing for iOS devices, because the sizes are quite constant or gradual increasing. And then you have the mobile later products. So example, I'm not sure if Techcelerate has any B2B startups. Do you have any B2B startups in Techcelerate, Manoj?
Yeah, we're B2B.
All right, cool. So, so in that case, usually B2B, as based on some of the research I've done, they have mobile later. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is just picked out from research I have picked. And a lot of B2B have complex UIs. So you can't try to put all of that complex UI into a mobile, into a mobile size screen. Hence the reason they go mobile later first, but their most value proposition is sold from a web app. Usual recommendation is that focus on one thing first to validate your value proposition. Otherwise, if you want to release your product in all kinds of devices or to all kinds of end users, then that's just going to add more time, which means more cost. So Usually, if you're building an MVP, it is time to market is, I think, the key value there, because ideally you want to validate your value proposition. Any questions on this? No. Cool.
I think, sorry, just a question. I don't know from your experience, have you used much open source existing projects? Because just thinking from our perspective, that's kind of what drove it in terms of we didn't want to really try and start something from scratch. So finding something that was open source and that had the community around was a good way to essentially get started and get up and running quickly.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we use a lot of open source libraries. However, again, I think a lot of this identifying a tech stack, identifying the technology framework you want to use depends mainly on the context and the company and the product you're going to build, right? So from our perspective, we didn't have any open source. So VoiceIQ's perspective, we didn't have any open source platform out there. What we did was we did use open source libraries and frameworks, but we built our product using around those and using those. But things like React Native, Angular, they're all open source as well, and there's plenty of community out there. So if you want to build a product, again, I think it depends on the product you're trying to build. So if there's an open source project out there, then go ahead, you can definitely use it. But I think what you need to consider are, if you do manage to validate your value proposition through that, and you think there's a good market out there, how are you going to scale that open source platform to take it to the next level? So those are some of the things that you probably need to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely for a quick access to validation.
Yeah. Cool. So one of the other things to consider, so obviously this does not primarily come under the technology stack, but a lot of things that one of the things that you need to consider are what kind of architecture that you want to use. Usually nowadays, most companies go down the cloud architecture route, and when you're going down the cloud architecture route, there are three streams that you could use. You could use the monolithic architecture, you could use the microservice architecture, and then you could use the serverless architecture. So my preference usually for an MVP with scale in mind for the future is still the monolithic architecture. But a lot of people still talk about microservices and serverless architectures. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them. But what you need to consider is that microservice architectures are not easy to build. They're very complex to build. And the reason behind that is, so just an example in the next screen. So as you can see, a microservice architecture has multiple backends. It has multiple databases. And to make sure that the communication between these backends work and the client side works, you need to have some kind of gateway. And you need to also make sure that the communication between backend to backend works properly. And if something breaks, how do you fix it? You need to consider database architecture here. Do you go with one single database or do you go with multiple databases? So if you're thinking of going to market fast, then microservice architecture is probably not the way to go for an MVP. However, so this is just an example from what we use at VoiceIQ. So we have a very similar setup to a monolithic architecture, but what we have done is we have created virtual segments within our monolithic backend, so that when the time comes and when we have done our analysis on the data we have collected, on example, which particular domain is getting the most amount of requests. Example, is it the user domain? Is it a calling domain? Or is it the authentication domain? Is it the financial domain? Based on those domains, we will then split out from the monolithic architecture and start creating microservices. So you kind of take a step-by-step approach in breaking down from monolithic to a microservice architecture. Going back, so you also have the serverless architecture stuff, and it's easy and quick to build, but the complexity comes when you have to manage them operationally. So example, when you so serverless architectures are where you build small functions into multiple, basically a small set of code into small functions. and then you allow it to kind of run it on the cloud services, and each of those functions have an endpoint, and they scale automatically. So that's all fine. However, the complexity comes when you want to manage the operational part of it. So example, how do you version this? How do you deploy it into production? How do you manage breaking changes, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. And I mean, from VoiceIQ's perspective, we have gone with monolithic and serverless architecture because we use the serverless approach that sits in front of our platform to manage all the incoming and outgoing connections from third-party services. But we use the monolithic architecture to manage our internal platform communication. So again, there is pros and cons for each of them. It's just that you guys have to have a good discussion with the technical team and understand the pros and cons, understand the cost it will have, the time it takes, and then make a decision on what needs to be followed. So these are some of the example MVP stacks that I have been involved in. So VoiceIQ, our primary stack is .NET Core, React, Cosmos DB, this is a document database, and Azure. But we have an extended stack, which is our AI platform that runs totally on Python. So that's our stack. Then I have worked with a company called Study Atlas. Again, this is their stack. Mango B2B, this is their stack. So as you can see, everything has a different stack, and there's no one stack fits all. There's no this is the best stack, and it all depends on what you call the context, depends on the product, and depends on how you want to scale it in the future. So before coming to this conclusion, I think one of the questions that was asked by Jeevan was what is a recommended stack for prototyping versus what is a recommended stack for scaling. So I think again it depends on the thing you want to prototype. For example, let's say you want to check if something related to a marketplace, then I would definitely recommend WordPress. It was so easy. I spent the last 2 weeks creating a small marketplace with WordPress, and it was all just putting in plugins and stuff like that. But this is just a marketplace example, yeah. But the thing that I found out was it was so huge that the WordPress platform is so chunky, and you can see that it will not scale as the load increases, and it's going to have so much trouble scaling because it's so heavy and it has so many unnecessary things just to run a small simple marketplace, and that's going to be an issue. So however, for a marketplace, I think WordPress would be good because it's free, unless the only thing you probably have to purchase is a couple of plugins and a theme. But if you do a marketplace on Shopify or some other platforms out there, they charge you on a user subscription base. They charge you for the transaction that go through the platform, etc., etc. If you're thinking about building a prototype for a mobile-based thing, then my recommendation would be React Native. It's quite easy. Again, React Native is my personal preference, but I think maybe people who know Vue.js, there might be good stacks like Vue Native and things like that. But I'm not familiar with Vue Native at the moment. However, you could use React Native. You could also use things like Xamarin to build mobile applications. And from a front-end perspective, my go-to stack would be React. And from a back-end perspective, for a quick prototype, I would use Node.js. And I wouldn't go with .NET because Node.js is pretty easy. You just kind of build using Express.js, you kind of build your API and quickly connect it to MongoDB, and boom, you're off the road. So my recommendation is a MERN stack, and the R could be React or React Native. It's up to you. However, if you want to build something for scalability, then I think you need to have discussions about what you want to achieve, or where you want, what does your product look like in the next, and how much users you might have, etc., etc. So the identification of a tech stack for a latter stage probably needs a little bit more discussion with context onto it. Hopefully that answers your question, Gio.
Yeah, thanks.
Right,
Thanks.
cool.
Just quick add on to that. If you're using MERN and then you want to scale, what would that look like? I'm just asking. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So from a MERN perspective, React and React Native, there's no much issue in scaling that. My only worry would be the Node.js, because MongoDB, I mean, there's no issue with scaling that either. However, you just have to be careful if you have things like transactional based logic. So for example, asset based logic, financial based logic, things like that. I'm not sure if MongoDB would be the best candidate for that. But I would replace the Node.js with a more strong suit backend, maybe like something like maybe Java or .NET. And I think Laravel is good as well. As I have seen, Node.js is not quite good at doing heavy lifting, but they're good for lightweight APIs. That's just my take on it. Maybe there are developers out there who doesn't go with me on that. So yeah.
Do they all have ORM? I mean, pretty much. So then it doesn't matter, right? Which database you can just plug in.
Correct. You're correct. Yes. So in .NET you have ORMs like Entity Framework, DBUp, and things like that. In Java you have ORMs like Hibernate and Hibernate, and then you have Spring Boot as another framework to capture your stack, what you call backend stack on it. So ORMs don't matter, but again, ORMs are good if you have identified your domain model and entity model correctly. So for example, if you have a entity model that doesn't follow strict SQL regulations or standards, then it's a different kind of entity model you have to use with an understanding of how your ORM framework works on that. But if you have an entity model that follows strict SQL standards and regulations, then the way you use the ORM again would be different, if that makes sense.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, welcome. So just finally the conclusion, think about the cost and time. So sometimes the cost to build quickly is quite cheap, but it might not be the correct way to build it. Cost to rebuild the whole thing after validation, you have to consider. So example, let's say you took the quick and dirty way. Now you have to think about the cost to rebuild the entire thing, because you have validated your proposition, people are happy, now you want to start doing your marketing and sales. But then you need to consider, does the current prototype platform that you have built, would it scale when you do your marketing and sales? Because the last thing you want is you put it out into production, you do a marketing sales push, and suddenly your production goes down. Or your platform goes down, and that has happened to me a couple of times in my previous company and in my current company. So, so it's not a good outlook for it. And then you have to, if the top two are out of your question, then you have to think about, okay, what is the cost and time it takes to build it correctly? And there are pros and cons to these two. So I will just take VoiceIQ as an example. So when we started VoiceIQ in 2017, we just had the presentation slide. We went to a company called M&G and we said, we could do this. Would you like us to build it for you? We just had presentation and idea, that's it. They said they were happy. So we could have built the MVP in like 1.5 months, 2 months. But what we did was we kind of thought about it properly and we built the MVP in 5 months. And we went back to them in 5 months and said, this is what we have built. The reason between the 2.5 month and a 5 month difference is that we spend more time understanding where our tech stack, what tech stack we want to use. So for example, we could have built in 2.5 months if we use the MERN tech stack, but we knew that if we use the MERN tech stack, we cannot scale it once we go live, because there are certain restrictions in Node.js that we already faced it, where you have memory leaks under heavy pressure, or you have some other issues with connecting to databases and stuff like that, especially with Node.js. So what we did was we initially spent a little bit more time and identified that our tech stack is going to be .NET, because example, one of the co-drivers was the 2 engineers at that time were from .NET background, but we also had a Node.js background. However, we were much more stronger on .NET. So we said, okay, let's use .NET as the backend. For the front end, we used React because we found out that Angular keeps changing very fast. Vue.js was quite new to the industry, and we were afraid of community support or whatever the libraries, what kind of libraries would be out there. So we took the safe bet and went with React. And then we built it in 5 months. It was all good. And then we started adding on more features and scaling the existing platform to cater the load. So now what we did was so our stack now contains multiple languages. So our core stack is .NET and React. We have certain parts in the application platform which used Node.js, but we replaced all of that with .NET Core. But we have our AI AI platform that runs in Python. And recently we have been doing load tests, and we currently can perform 330,000 calls per second because our one is a VoIP platform. So we can run 330,000 calls at any given time, and it scales without an issue. And that's with maybe 3 or 4 boxes. That's about it, and not much more than that. So again, we spent a little bit more time, a little bit more cost, and then went with the ideal tech platform rather than doing a quick hack with a prototype tech stack and then trying to re-engineer all of that into something else. So that's just an example of what VoiceIQ has used. So this base tech stack, again, you can have a base tech stack like the MERN, but you can have something else that, example, Node.js probably might not be good at processing certain things. So you have a substitute tech stack do those kind of processes. So one of the things is don't just stick to one tech stack and try to build everything in that, because maybe the selected tech stack is not probably good for that. So for a simple example, VoiceIQ didn't use .NET for building AI models because it's not the best one. We use things like TensorFlow, we use things like PyTorch. So the ideal tech stack for that is Python. Hence the reason we went with that. And finally, like I said before, there is no tech stack that one size fits all. It always depends on the product you're going to build, the kind of user base you're going to approach, if it's going to be mobile first, mobile later, mobile only, etc. And again, there's no such thing as the best stack. It depends. So yeah, I think that's about it. And I have put in references so that if I will share out the slides, and then people can have read through these references if needed.
So we got, thank you very much, Amila. We got about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah.
I've got a quick question.
Sure.
So no, it's really informative, and it sort of reconfirms a lot of what we're doing. We're using a monolithic structure, and I think we're using MERN or MEAN, I'm not sure which one. But the question I have is there anything you can put in front of your tech stack to automate queuing of users? So I used to work for a startup called Net Precept. They no longer exist. But what they do is if you get a burst of traffic to your site, it queues the users going into the platform. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's anything available commercially that does that for you.
Commercially, I'm not sure, but you could build things like that. So basically, once you get onto basically what you're saying is once they enter your URL, they'll be placed on a queue till the server-side load becomes
just to protect the users inside the platform, inside the mobile app, or inside the website.
Yeah, there is a way you can do that, but I'm not sure. I mean, from a product perspective, I'm not sure if users would stay in that queue for a long time or would they leave. But there are services that helps you to do that, and you could build you could build your own thing that helps you to do that. So I could give you some references.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. It's more about protecting the server crashing, and also protecting if you've got a server that scales, that you don't end up with loads of fees if you have a massive traffic to the site, to the application.
Yeah. So usually what I've not these days, very rarely I come across platforms where it queues people. But there are different solutions you could apply to solve your problem before implementing a queue. And usually the things that crashes are mainly because of a database bottleneck, because your servers might scale, but it can only scale so much because the database connection. If you're using SQL, then there's a connection pool that allows you to connect to your database. And if that exceeds or that gets exhausted, then everybody basically gets blocked. However, there are ways that you could solve this problem. So let's say, for example, again, the easiest thing is Amazon, right? So you get millions of people going into that at the same time. However, what they do is they basically use, one of the discussions we had yesterday on the Techcelerate WhatsApp channel was using a queuing system, programmatical queue, where everything happens asynchronously, not synchronously. So for example, I make an order, and maybe after 2 or 3 minutes, you get an email, and it just, that helps you to scale certain parts of your application separately. And as a result, you don't have to implement a queuing system for your users, but you could use a queuing system for your communication within the platform.
Okay.
I think it's a good example where, especially if you have to download something, they always queue that and rather than give it to you directly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I had a question more around looking at, so it's a bit past the MVP stage, but looking at infrastructure as code and looking at it as a way of scaling.
Mm-hmm.
So with stack like JavaScript or Python, you can write, I know in AWS at least, you can write your infrastructure as code. So is this something that you've looked at or considered in terms of?
Yeah, so what we do is we use something called Terraform. And that's, it's not Python or JavaScript, I think its own HCL. It's a declarative language, and our entire stack, basically so VoiceIQ has 7 environments, and all the way from QA to customer production. And none of those stacks, we don't go and, none of those environments or infrastructure, we manually go and update. We run everything to our infrastructure as a code approach. And the advantage is, during example weekends after 8 p.m. UK time, we completely scrap the entire environment through jobs, like things like Jenkins, run Terraform code to destroy the entire environment and then rebuild it back up at 6 o'clock Sri Lankan time, because our engineers are in Sri Lanka. So the reason for that is we save cost, and every time you come to the platform, it's almost like brand new. So any glitches that you're supposed to find when you go to production could be found out in dev and QA. But mainly we do it to save cost because we are running on cloud credits and we want to stretch that cloud credit as much as possible. So, and at night when nobody's using, your servers are running, it's costing your cloud credits, it's absolutely pointless. So that's why we use infrastructure as a code. You can use, in Azure, you have something called ARM templates, and in AWS, you have something called Cloud Foundation or Cloud Formation. Cloud Formation, yeah. You could use those. However, what we do is we use Terraform because when you write the code base in Terraform, you can have different plugins to either change it to run it on AWS or to run it on Azure or to run it on GCP. So it's one level code base, but the plugins you select helps you to change that.
Okay. I was thinking more the reason I was thinking the JavaScript and Python ways is more in terms of building the team. So do you have, I guess, I assume you have someone that's at least dedicated on the Terraform side of things?
Yes. Terraform. So we have DevOps engineers who are, so the DevOps engineers, they are in 2 parts. They usually do JavaScript based internal products so that they can, have one single platform to manage our Jenkins build servers for building, our Terraform code bases, or to update infrastructure, checking our monitoring, checking our logging, all of that. But these guys also are knowledgeable enough to go and write the Terraform code to automate the infrastructure. So that's how we have hired our DevOps engineers.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
We got 4 minutes left. Anybody else? No, very shy. Okay, Amila is available through WhatsApp groups or IATRO. So I was hoping Thomas from IATRO would be here because he's built a whole business on WordPress. So would be interesting to see how he scales. For Furlough Life, we build it on WordPress because That's the easiest thing to do. We've got to work out then after, we still got to do a lot, but if we submitted for a grant application, if we get the money, we got to work out saying, what's going to be our proper first version of furlough live phase. Yeah, so Amila, thank you very much. Very informative, and hope everybody got something out. Yes. Last chance, any more questions?
I had one that's kind of not really related, but has anyone used nocode.tech, and is that good for founders? I haven't used it, so I'm just asking.
The no code for tech is things like Bubble.io, Wix, stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one level higher than Wix. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's very similar. Is that stuff useful for founders? Is my question.
Yeah, so I have come across one company that uses. So they were finding for React Native developers, but they couldn't find or they couldn't hire, and they started using Bubble.io. But it seems to be okay. I have never used Bubble.io, and they have managed to build the application in what you call I think 2 or 3 months using Bubble.io. It's a mobile app. So far it has worked for them in MVP, but now the questions they are having is how do we scale this? How do we secure the configuration? How do we how do we know that this is going to scale in the future, etc., etc. So those are the questions that they have come, and because they have no control over it, and also they're putting 100% dependency on that particular Bubble.io platform being available. So that's
probably for hypothesis testing or something like that.
Correct.
Right?
So I discussed this with Thomas at Iatro, because he's actually built an app in a day, and he was quite impressed. But then once we started discussing, the issue came out. You have to use their platform. There's no way out. You can't take it out and use somewhere else. So that's a big problem.
I think it's great for getting something up and running. I'm working with a guy that's doing some stuff on Bubble at the moment. It's awesome. It comes back to Twitter 2008, third-party dependency. You rely on a platform you have no control over. They decide to change something or go bust or whatever, and that's your business gone. Good to get started, but I wouldn't bet the bank on it.
So do you know, because we were thinking of using something like Bubble.io to test like some front end, like user flow things, but do you know how well it kind of works in terms of authenticating with existing applications or other application or another backend?
So Sofian, you should, sorry to step in, you should have a chat with Thomas, because he said he connected with some existing infrastructure as well, and he works like a trade. But so one of the other things is, Bharat, you should actually look at that as well, because that might give you a quick result.
I'm going to continue with the route we got, Matt.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want to know more about sort of the no code, low code type aspect, I'll drop it in the message, but there's a no code coffee email comes out every day about all the stuff that's happening in that environment, who the players are, where investments are, what to build in, loads of stuff. So I'll drop it in the chat or a link somewhere. It's well worth reading. It's a daily email update.
Yeah. Right, we've gone past 1 minute. If there's no burning question, I'll wrap this up. Thank you very much, Amila.
I think.
Bye.
Thanks, Amila. Very useful.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Amila. Take care. See everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye.